In April of 1990, Tonya Hughes was found dead on the side of the road. All around her, groceries were scattered, and her body was convulsing from the shock of being hit by a fast-moving car. Despite fighting for her life in a hospital, she died just 5 days later. But Tonya hadn't really died that day, because Tonya didn't exist. She had stolen that name, and before that, she had been known as Sharon Marshall. However, Sharon Marshall wasn't her real name either. Her real name was Suzanne. Since she was just a small child, Suzanne had lived with the man that kidnapped her under fake names and stories. First posing as her father and then becoming her husband, her captor and abuser had been in control of her life as long as she could remember, until one April day in 1990. However, the death of Tonya began unraveling a series of lies and secrets constructed to ensure the monster could continue to be free and do as he pleased. This is the story of the many lives of Franklin Delano Floyd. "21-year-old Tonya Hughes had her headphones on when she was walking back to her motel after picking up groceries at the local market. At the motel she was staying at, her husband Clarence and her 2-year-old son were waiting for her. Suddenly, a car accelerated from behind her. She didn't hear it, since she was playing her music, but even if she'd heard it, she would have had little time to react. The car was speeding towards her with the intention of hitting her, and it did. Tonya was left on the ground, and the car sped off. Tonya was soon found on the side of the road. She was convulsing and appeared to be gravely injured, so she was rushed to the hospital. Her injuries were severe, and she was put in a coma with hopes that she could recover. From the moment she was brought in, doctors were skeptic about how much of an accident this really was. While she was in hospital, she barely got any visitors, since her husband demanded nobody enter the room except for him and doctors. While Tonya did seem to respond well at some points of her treatment, she suddenly passed away after her 5th day in intensive care. But who exactly was Tonya? That in itself is somewhat of a mystery. Tonya Dawn Hughes had appeared in Tulsa, Oklahoma, just a year earlier, in 1989, as a newly married woman. Her husband Clarence Hughes had been a painter, but couldn't work anymore because of a back injury. The couple had a 2-year-old son to raise, so Tonya found a job at a strip club called Passions. At the club, she befriended another dancer called Connie. Although Tonya was very secretive about her background and her family, she slowly warmed up to Connie and began confiding in her about life at home. Clarence was abusive. Not only was he keeping all the money she made at the club, but he would demand she made at least $200 a night. If not, he'd become aggressive. Tonya was barely left alone. Clarence would drive her to the club and wait in the parking lot until her shift was over, collecting her money as soon as she was out. So it was only during her work in the club where Tonya could really be away from him, and she took this time to talk about her home situation with Connie. Having met him a few times when he drove Tonya to work, Connie and other people who worked at the club mentioned how they didn't like Clarence. Not only was he controlling, but he was also unpleasant to everyone. They mentioned remembering their relationship as strange, and Tonya was never herself when she was around him, like she was when he wasn't there. She had also started seeing one of the club's customers, and the two had begun dating. Her friend urged her to leave with him, to grab her son and go as far away as she could from her husband. However, Tonya could never do that. She was terrified of him. She said she knew too much about who he was, and he'd always find her. And so, Tonya stayed by her husband's side until April 25th of 1990, when the hit and run claimed her life. After Tonya's death, a coroner performed an autopsy and made several notes about the 21-year-old. Her injuries were not all consistent with the hit and run. There was also a blow to the back of the head and other signs of past injuries in her bones. They also noted Tonya had several pregnancies and had given birth multiple times. However, those who knew her only knew of the existence of Michael. Where were all these other children? After a detailed analysis of her remains, the coroner listed her cause of death a homicide, since it felt like the car had been making a point to hit her. It didn't look like an accident. Tonya's funeral was held a few days later on May 4th of 1990, but it wasn't her husband who organized and paid for it. He refused to do so, so her co-workers and the owner of the club came forward and paid for everything. Tonya had been loved by those who worked with her, and they couldn't accept that she wouldn't receive a proper goodbye. Clarence didn't like that, and actually attended the funeral making a scene and insulting those present. Police were investigating Tonya's potential homicide to try and find out who could be behind the attack. Her husband was a suspect from the start, but he mentioned he was at the motel waiting for her when she was hit, and no witnesses or evidence could prove otherwise. Despite this, they kept a close eye on him, and very quickly things took a turn, and investigators uncovered that Clarence was keeping a very big secret. Just days after Tonya's funeral, and with an investigation on her death still ongoing, Clarence tried to cash in the money from a life insurance policy he had on his wife. When speaking on the phone to the insurance company, he was asked to give out his social security number. The number he gave appeared to not exist, so he tried another one. When that one also resulted to be a non-existent number, he gave a third. The insurance company entered the number and discovered it was not Clarence Hughes' number, but the number belonging to a Franklin Delano Floyd, and Franklin was wanted for several other crimes committed years before. Scared that he'd made a terrible mistake, Clarence, aka Franklin, took off, leaving his 2-year-old son behind. Franklin Delano Floyd had been born in 1943 in Barnesville, Georgia, into a family of 5 children. His father was a heavy drinker, and in 1944, when he was just turning 1 year old, he passed away due to a liver failure at the age of 32. His mother was left with nothing to support her 5 children, so a year after her husband passed, she took them to an orphanage. Franklin had a tough time at the orphanage. He was abused and mistreated by staff and other children older than him during his entire time there. At the age of 16, he ran away from the children's home and decided to enlist in the army under fake paperwork since he was still underage. However, months later, his forged paperwork was discovered and he was kicked out of the army, ending up in the care of his older sister and her family. His time with his sister and her husband was not long. Soon after arriving and after many arguments and fights, his brother-in-law kicked him out of their home, and Franklin was once again trying to find his next place in the world. By 1962, he had been in jail several times already for armed robbery, forging licenses, and violating his parole. However, despite it all, he always found a way out. Whether it was the charges were dropped or someone paid his bond, Franklin was always out in the street soon after being arrested. As he got older, his crimes started escalating. He wasn't just stealing and forging documents anymore. In 1962, when he was 19 years old, he abducted a 4-year-old girl from a bowling alley and abused her right there in a secluded area. He was caught and convicted for child molestation and sentenced to 20 years. However, after being sent to a mental institution, he managed to escape a year later. During the 60s and the 70s, he was constantly on the run for something and always ended up getting away with it. He changed his name and location frequently, but always ended up in another prison. However, for unknown reasons, in 1972, and still without completing any of his sentences, he was released to a halfway house, and a year later, he was paroled. A few days later, he attacked another woman and was arrested, but a friend paid his bond and he was released once again. After that last incident, he vanished. Or, at least Franklin did. Brandon Williams, however, had just arrived in North Carolina. Under his new name, Brandon Williams, he met a woman called Sandy Chipman. Sandy was a sex worker, and she lived with her 4 children, Suzanne from her first marriage, and Amy, Allison, and Philip, born from her second marriage. Sandy and Brandon began dating in 1974 after they met at a truck stop in North Carolina. They'd only been together for a month when Brandon asked Sandy to marry him. She accepted, and as well as joining him as his wife, she gave him custody of her 4 children. Shortly after getting married, in 1975, Sandy was given a 30-day sentence after she was caught passing bad checks. While she was away, the children became Brandon's responsibility since he was their legal guardian. However, when she finished her 30 days in jail, she returned home only to find it empty. Brandon and her 4 children were gone. She immediately went to the police, but since he had custody of the minors, and she had willingly made him responsible for them while she was away, it wasn't technically kidnapping, and no missing person reports were ever filed. Since the police weren't helping, Sandy began searching for her children herself. She found Allison and Amy, her 2 middle daughters, in a church-run home for children. However, there was never any sign of Philip, her youngest son who was still a baby at the time, or Suzanne, her eldest, who was barely 6 years old. Brandon had also disappeared. Franklin quickly ditched that name as soon as he moved to Oklahoma. In 1975, he had become Trenton Davis, and along with him was a little girl, about 6 years old, with blonde hair and blue eyes. Nobody knew where they came from or who the girl's mother could be, and nobody asked those questions when Trenton Davis enrolled her at Wilson Elementary School as his daughter, Suzanne Davis. As far as the neighbors could see, they were a normal family, just a father trying to raise his daughter. However, when people looked closer, they could sense something wasn't right. In 1978, a babysitter who would often take care of Suzanne while Trenton was working witnessed disturbing behavior that did not seem normal for a father and daughter. She reported it to the police, but before they could take action, father and daughter had packed up and left. For years, Franklin and his alleged daughter traveled from state to state, using different names, all of which are on record at the different schools she was enrolled in. The only place they seemed to stay a little longer was Atlanta, Georgia, when in 1984 they lived as Warren and Sharon Marshall. 15-year-old Sharon attended Forest Park High School, and that is where she began showing signs of how intelligent she was. Her teachers remember her as being bright, happy, and upbeat. She had many friends and a few boyfriends too. Her grades were always good, and she took part in many school activities, and for the first time, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Her life at home, however, continued to be the same. Her father Warren had a job painting houses, but it didn't make him a lot of money. Sharon had a best friend at the time, Jennifer, who she'd met at camp. Jennifer barely visited Sharon's home, and she remembers her father was very strict. She did, however, once stay for a sleepover, and she saw that Sharon had many items of clothing that seemed inappropriate for a teenager, and things only became stranger when Sharon told Jennifer that the clothes had been given to her by her father. Despite her unstable home life, Sharon seemed to be finding refuge in her studies. She graduated high school and got accepted into Georgia Tech. She wanted to study aerospace engineering, and her dream was to work for NASA one day. However, her big dreams didn't fit in her life, where her father refused to send her to college, even after she had received a full scholarship. Instead, he insisted she got a job waiting tables at a local restaurant, which she did, and she took all the money she made home to her father. Just like any other teenager, Sharon began dating. She had a boyfriend at the time, whom she loved dearly. When she found out she was pregnant, she tried to run away with him, and they made it to Alabama, but Warren found her, and he took her away. Once again, they fell off the face of the earth, and Sharon had to give away her child when she gave birth. By this point, Suzanne was used to packing up and leaving. She'd been doing it all her life, and as a victim of her captor, she was too afraid to question him. Soon after giving birth to the child she was forced to give up, she was once again pregnant. Although they were still known as Warren and Sharon Marshall, there was nothing left of that bright teenager who'd been accepted to college. Instead, Warren forced her to get a job as a stripper at a club, even when she was pregnant. He would constantly be with her, afraid that she'd run away again, and he would even try to see her work at the club. People around them began suspecting something was going on, since it was a very strange dynamic for a father and daughter. However, nobody ever dug deeper. Sharon seemed to be making friends at work again, and one of these friends was Cheryl Ann Commesso, who was also a dancer at the club. Sharon and Cheryl were friends, and Warren didn't like that one bit. Once during a boat ride, Warren made advances on Cheryl, who was 18 years old, and when she told him to leave her alone, he began screaming at her and even got physically violent with her. After that, Sharon and Cheryl's relationship was never the same. Cheryl was so angry at Warren that she decided to report to the police that Sharon was receiving welfare checks while she was making over $1,500 a week at the club. Warren was furious, especially being as controlling he was over money, and he confronted Cheryl. The two had an argument in the club in front of many witnesses, and a few days later, Cheryl's car would be found abandoned, and her family never heard from her again. She too had vanished. Shortly after this fight, Warren and Sharon also vanished. Their trailer mysteriously caught fire, and using the insurance money, the two left Tampa, with a very pregnant Sharon reluctantly following her stepfather once again. After leaving Florida, new names were in order. The couple ditched their father-daughter status and became husband and wife. When they were in New Orleans, Franklin got a hold of new fake identities and married his victim. They were now Mr. and Mrs. Clarence and Tonya Hughes. The baby was born in 1988. It was a boy, and they named him Michael. For some reason, this time Franklin decided they would keep him. After spending some time in New Orleans, they packed and moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where our story began. After the funeral and Clarence disappearing with the police searching for him, Tonya's memory was still alive among those who loved her. Her friend Connie, along with the club owner, thought it was important to find out who she was to notify any family she had of her death, since none of them had come to the funeral. Connie knew Tonya was very protective of her past. She rarely mentioned it, never spoke of any family, and she seemed to have nobody apart from her husband and son. But seeing that she was so young, she thought she must have someone out there who would care to know that she had passed. So they took on the mission of finding out who her family was. After searching her alleged maiden name, Tadlock, and after a few phone calls, they discovered something they were never expecting. Tonya had stolen her identity from a child who had passed away 20 years earlier from a fatal case of pneumonia. The Tonya Tadlock Hughes they met didn't actually exist. After sharing this information with the police, speaking to Franklin was becoming even more urgent. Who was the woman he was married to? And why were they using fake names? In the meantime, Michael was placed into the care of Ernest and Merle Bean. The foster parents took Michael in as a 2-year-old, but reported his behavior was severely underdeveloped. He behaved like a baby and had obvious signs of trauma. As they would learn later by taking him to therapy and counseling, Michael was often locked in a bedroom wardrobe while his father was away taking his mother to work. He'd spent hours in there alone, in the dark, and he was terrified. The Beans took care of Michael, and since Franklin had disappeared and was being chased by the police, they decided to formally adopt Michael and began the paperwork to make it happen. Michael still had a chance to be happy and raised in a home where he was loved and cared for. However, it wouldn't be long before Franklin made sure that would never happen. Franklin was eventually found and placed under arrest for some of the federal charges against him from years before. However, once again he was paroled and began working at an apartment complex as a maintenance worker. During this time at the apartment complex, he let himself into a young woman's apartment using the key he had everyone give him for maintenance. When the woman walked in after being out with her friends, she caught Franklin rummaging through her drawers, and when she tried to run off, he attacked her with a knife. Luckily, she managed to get away just as her boyfriend arrived, and Franklin was placed under arrest once again. However, as it usually happened with Franklin, he managed to pay bond and he was released, awaiting his appearance in court the next week. Letting him out that time would result in another tragedy, this time involving his alleged son, Michael. On September 4th of 1994, the Beans got Michael ready for school and dropped him off, just like they always did. A few hours later, a man appeared in the principal's office holding a gun. It was Franklin, and he was telling the principal not to make a scene and to bring him Michael. Scared for his life and for the safety of the whole school, the principal obeyed orders and fetched the 6-year-old. Franklin then forced both Michael and the principal into the principal's truck, and they drove off into the woods. Once there, he tied the school principal to a tree and took off in his truck with the boy. The principal would be found hours later, but by that time it was too late, and Franklin and Michael were miles away, and nobody knew where. Police were now on the hunt for Franklin. He had kidnapped a child who at this time had been proven not to be his son. As part of the adoption process, Franklin told authorities he would fight for custody. However, due to his criminal record, he was denied that fight. The Beans adoption process would continue, and now they needed a DNA test to confirm if Franklin was the father or not, since there were many doubts on the table. The test confirmed Michael was not Franklin's son, and this made him furious. So he had taken matters into his own hands and decided to take Michael from school that day, in hopes that he could start a life with him like he'd done years before with Suzanne. However, months later, the truck would be found near Kansas, and there was no sign of Franklin or Michael. A mechanic was working on the truck, and when he took it apart, he found something very disturbing. Hidden next to the gas tank in the truck was an envelope. It was heavy, and it seemed full. When the mechanic opened it, he found nearly 100 photographs, and in these pictures, several different children can be seen, in different poses. One of the girls in the pictures was his own wife, but she seemed to be much younger, almost a child. When investigators dug deeper, they discovered the truth. His wife Tonya was actually Sharon, the girl he'd been raising as his daughter, all those years earlier. The manhunt for Franklin got serious. Not only was he wanted for kidnapping now, he was the main suspect in a murder investigation. After searching for months, he was finally located in November of 1994 in Kentucky, where he found a job at a dealership under another fake identity. When he was arrested, he claimed to have no clue about where Michael was, telling the police he'd sent him off to live with some friends and he hadn't seen him since. Franklin was under arrest, but the story was far from being over. When analyzing the pictures, they found that several items and furniture belonged to Franklin, confirmed by several witnesses. But another interesting photograph was of an 18-year-old girl who was covered in injuries. The woman was Cheryl Ann, who'd been missing since 1989. This discovery helped investigators solve another mystery. In 1995, as Franklin was awaiting trial, a woman's skeletal remains were discovered in Florida. She was never identified, but she was found with all her clothing, jewelry, and a breast implant. When police discovered Cheryl was in one of the pictures, they tested the anonymous remains with dental records, and it was confirmed. The Jane Doe was Cheryl Ann, and the injuries found on her skeleton were consistent with some of the injuries seen on the photographs. She was even wearing some of the items found with her remains, suggesting that picture had been taken just hours before she was murdered. With this information developing as Franklin awaited trial, his charges shifted, and as well as kidnapping, he was now accused of first-degree murder. He was also still a suspect in the homicide that killed his wife Tonya, now also referred to as Sharon, but there was no proof that he was the one behind the wheel that night. There was also no sign of Michael anywhere. Franklin Delano Floyd was ruled incompetent to stand trial in 2001. However, he appealed and stated he was competent. In fact, he told the judge he was hoping for a death sentence. After a short deliberation, Franklin was in fact sentenced to death for the murder of Cheryl Ann, and also found guilty of the kidnapping and disappearance of Michael. After being sent to death row, he would admit to several cellmates that he had killed his wife that night. However, his story changed several times, and since there was no proof, her murder was never pinned on him. What he never did was give information of what happened to Michael, whose disappearance remained unsolved.
They just wanted me because I wouldn't give up Michael. I still got him hid. I ain't never telling them where he's at. I don't care if I die in this prison.
For years, he kept telling the same stories. He told investigators that Michael was married and living in Kansas City. Other times he told them he was in a foreign country. The stories kept getting more and more elaborate as the years went by, until 2015, when the FBI pressed him and he finally told them what happened that day. And the truth was that Michael had been killed just hours after he was kidnapped. According to Franklin, the 6-year-old was in a panic state when he took him, and on the drive to Texas, Franklin felt he was out of control. Not only was there a paternity test proving him wrong, but Michael was happy in his new life. Franklin couldn't take that, but he wasn't going to let him go back to his new parents either. He knew he wouldn't be able to control him like he controlled his mother years earlier, and that's when he decided he would stop the car and he shot him twice on the back of the head, leaving his remains in the woods near the Interstate 35. The FBI immediately conducted a search of the area, but Michael's remains were never found. Too many years had gone by, and in an area full of wild animals, any remains would have disappeared by 2015. But there was still one more mystery left unsolved. Where had his daughter Sharon come from, and what happened to his wife Sandy's missing children, Philip and Suzanne? After confessing to Michael's tragic ending, he also gave information about these children. Philip had been given away to a family for adoption. After this information went public years later in 2019, a man came forward thinking he could be Philip. Tests were conducted and it was confirmed he was Sandy's lost baby. However, Suzanne had never left Franklin's side. She had just changed her name. Although we see it clearly now, up until that point, nobody had made the connection. The lack of missing persons report when Sandy told the police her children were gone, and the constant moving from state to state, meant Franklin got away with presenting Suzanne as his own daughter, although nobody knew where she had come from or who her mother was. The mysterious daughter Franklin turned up with was in fact Suzanne, who was stripped of her identity and given aliases all her life. When she was finally identified, the plaque on her tombstone was updated to show her real name, the one she was never allowed to use: Suzanne Marie Sevakis.